We're so happy to have you here today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see you better.
Thank you very much, Erica and Jen, and to all of you who have enabled this conversation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of your program, and I think it's a real privilege for me to have a conversation with so many of you all over the world. As Erica said, I'm in Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so it's morning. But in many ways, we all inhabit the same world, even though we're scattered in many different places and different time zones and so on. And I think this issue that we're discussing today, which is distress migration, its causes and its impacts, is something.
Chandan, I believe you're next.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving me this floor. I am Chandan. I am from Bangladesh also. We all know that migration is nowadays worldwide. In Bangladesh, Rohingya issue is major one. My question are, one, what role can world politics play in overcoming this migration? And second one, is it really possible to stop migration worldwide? If not, what are the main barriers? Please, example, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is an excellent question, which maybe will take me on to my second set of comments, and we'll pause. Please keep your questions up there, but maybe I'll use the opportunity of answering Chandan's question to make some more general points. So the first question is, what do we think about migration in general and distress migration in particular? Is this something we want to stop, something we want to encourage, something we want to regulate? And I would say that a couple of points. The first is that human beings have always migrated since the beginning of our history. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, people have always moved. They've moved for exactly the same reasons as I mentioned earlier. They've moved because of conflict. They've moved for opportunity, as some of you were saying. They've moved for conquest sometimes to, get resources of other people's lands. They've moved for family reasons because somebody else is somewhere, so you join them. They've moved for a whole range of reasons, sometimes for trade, moved back and forth, sometimes trade, which is intended to be temporary, then becomes permanent. So people have moved for all sorts of reasons. And until the beginning of the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, people were not stopped from migrating. On the contrary, many governments, countries, rulers saw migrants as an asset, more labor power, more wealth. In fact, if you think of the history of our kind of civilizational history, some of the worst examples of exploitation and hardship are people being forced to migrate who didn't want to, enslavement, indenture. These are people who were forced to leave their land by people who wanted to use their labor. So we have changed our attitude very much from a situation in which, countries have seen migrants, seen people arriving as an asset, like natural resources, like, a good crop. You see, well, you have all these young, healthy, hardworking people coming. It's an asset. It strengthens your economy. It strengthens your government. Why would you want to stop it? And so it's a very interesting history to look at how the transformation has happened. And we can talk more about that. But in a nutshell, what happened really in the 19th and 20th century is that nation states really saw one of their main prerogatives as a state being to control their borders. Nation states saw one of their main prerogatives as being the ability to exclude non-nationals from their territory, non-citizens. And that is still where we are today. And the protections that we have for some people, like refugees, are an exception to that general rule. So the general rule, whether you're in Bangladesh or in Pakistan or in Argentina or wherever you may be in Somalia, the general rule is that governments and nation states have the right to exclude non-citizens from their country. They regulate who comes in. they decide if you have a legitimate reason to come in, you have a legitimate visa, then you can come in. And otherwise, you can be excluded. But the big exception to that is protection of people who are facing persecution, which I mentioned earlier, refugees. So and this is an important point. Refugee law, international refugee law, is an exception to the general rule that non-citizens can be excluded from a country, which is why it's so important sometimes for people to prove that they are a refugee, because that's the only way they can get a legal status in a country. So let me explain. If you are fleeing persecution, say you're fleeing persecution because you are, for example, in Afghanistan, there are many different ethnic groups. And one of the ethnic groups, large ethnic group called the Hazara, were and continue to be discriminated against by other dominant groups in the country. So Hazara have fled trying to get refugee status elsewhere, not because they had a work permit, not because they had a family member who could bring them in, because they said, we are facing persecution. And so because of refugee protection, we should be allowed in. So the answer to your question, Chandan, is one way of regulating migration is to ensure that people who need protection outside their country can get it. And I think what's happening in our world today is that access to that protection is getting harder and harder. There are more and more barriers preventing people who need safety from getting safety. So people have to take more and more complicated journeys to get to a place of safety. Sometimes they have to hire smugglers or traffickers just to enable them to cross a border because the border is closed. And that's what's so unusual about the Ukraine situation, unlike what happened for the Syrians, unlike what happened for the Afghans. That for the Ukrainians, the European Union said, come in, our borders are open, you're welcome. And what's more, we'll give you a legal status straight away. Imagine if that had happened for the Syrians. There wouldn't have been so many drownings in the Mediterranean. There wouldn't have been people being raped by traffickers, having to go through torturous routes. So I think a very critical point here is the need for legal protections for people who need to flee. The other thing I would say, just two other things here. One is that I think it's very important to increase access to legal migration much more broadly than we have at the moment. At the moment, we have a system where if you are highly skilled, you have a much better chance of getting a legal visa. If you're a computer scientist or you're a doctor or you're an engineer, you have a much better chance of getting a legal visa than if you are a factory worker or an agricultural worker. But it's not that people don't need factory workers. It's not that people don't need agricultural workers. But they are not getting the legal visas they need. And so people come in unlawfully or without a regular status and are very exploitable. So one key thing, I think, is to increase access to legal migration for unskilled populations. The second thing, and this would apply to, I think, many of you, is that young people, ambitious young people, have very few legal opportunities for migration. If you're rich, if you're absolutely extraordinarily brilliant, you're an Einstein and you get some sort of rare scholarship, then you can get a legal status. But very often, lots of young people who are wanting to get an education, who want to get an internship, who want to get an apprenticeship, who want to learn skills, have great difficulty migrating legally. And so either they're blocked or very often they end up in unsafe situations and are taken advantage of in order to get into a country without a legal status. And I think these are very serious problems in the current landscape. So to summarize my answer, I would say the task is not to stop migration. The task should be to make migration safe and legal and regular, to increase the opportunities for people who want to migrate and to make it so that there is a regular system. That people don't have to move irregularly or illegally, don't have to put themselves at risk, don't have to lie about who they are, don't have to hide and be frightened, because many people are in that situation, even though their labor is used day after day. And it's well known that many Western countries would collapse tomorrow if all the undocumented migrant labor were forced to leave, because who would be servicing the trains? Who would be in the hospitals? Who would be looking after the elderly people? So I think these are very important points.